Hi everyone, I'm here with Zach Jones and we're talking about his new book, Growing Up in Flames, which comes out March 1. Zach, thanks very much for this book. I really enjoyed reading it. And my first question for you was if you could tell us about the book in your own words.
Okay. So I suppose conceptually the book explores the idea of adolescent identity responding to trauma. So it kind of follows four main characters, but from three perspectives. And all of those characters have experienced trauma in some kind of way. And it kind of explores the different ways that they respond to that. And the ones that are looking to heal, the ones that have no idea the damage they're passing on to others, and the ones that are looking for escape, looking to get away from it. So, and it does that largely through the story of Kenna, who I kind of think of as the main character, who has moved to the small town her mum grew up in after her mum dies in a bushfire. And then is pretty continually re-triggered by fire around her. So there's the cane fires of the region. She witnesses an act of arson, and the whole book kind of spirals from there as she tries to learn about and connect with, the ghost of her mum.
Yeah, it's a really good succinct answer. I would say exactly the same thing. That it's yeah, and it certainly is a really powerful book because it does deal with trauma, and all the characters are sort of grappling with that in different ways. What inspired you to write it?
It's a good question. It grew a lot. It didn't start the way it is now. It was always going to deal with trauma, and I work as a psychologist, so I deal with trauma a lot, and have a lot of those conversations. And so I guess I had a lot of thoughts about it, and a lot that I was grappling with in the work that I was doing with people on similar issues. Partly geographically, Kenna's journey kind of mirrors mine. I grew up in the Blue Mountains, and which is where it's kind of alluded to that she grew up and where her mum died, and then moved to the Northern Rivers, and the whole fire thing kind of came out of that journey, because I grew up with bushfires. They were more or less a yearly occurrence. Sometimes they were bad, sometimes they were just distant, and it was just smoky for a few days, and then moved to the Northern Rivers region of New South Wales, and it's one of the last regions that does cane fires as part of the sugarcane harvesting process. So it's pretty common during a certain time of year to just drive by entire fields on fire next to the road, which was really different and really normalizing of fire. And I suppose reflecting on that, I kind of thought a bit about the similar ways that fire and trauma work, in that there's often a predisposition, whether it's that an area of bush is particularly dry, or there's been a lot of deadfall, and then there's some point of ignition, and then from there's a whole bunch of damage, and afterwards that leaves a fairly barren kind of wasteland, which in terms of trauma emotionally, that's often where people end up feeling that they find it difficult to connect with other people, and they feel powerless, and that much of their life and their joy has been taken from them. But I always remember growing up in the mountains, a couple of months after a bushfire had been through, you'd see all the regrowth on the trees, and it was always really strange because the trees just look fuzzy, because it regrows from everywhere all at once. And I thought that was a really powerful symbol for exploring trauma, and the idea that regrowth and redemption and building a new life is possible. And Kenna's story is the one that really moves towards that.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be healing. It's a bit rocky along the way, but
yeah, absolutely. So as you said, there's 4 points of view in this story. Well, I'd say 4. I mean, one is as diary entries.
One is the diary entries. Yeah.
Yeah. But I sort of had 2 questions about that. The first one really was about the mechanics of writing 4 different points of view. How did you sort of wrestle with that? How did you write all of them separately? Did you switch between the voices, or how did you do it?
It depends in which draft. When I first wrote it, it was all from Kenna's point of view, and I think it was all first person present tense. And I went back and did a massive rewrite, and really tried to diversify the voices. And yeah, when I did that, I wrote the diary entries I wrote as a block, and I came back and added to them and changed them. But I sat down and wrote a diary, and then took excerpts of that diary to use in the book. And the other ones I switched between as I went. Kenna's I already had, but it was a matter of like cutting and editing that, and then picking where I wanted to move to Noah and James. And I suppose one of the things I wanted to accomplish in that was a bit of polyphony, just having multiple voices talking about the same issue to kind of indicate it's not necessarily an issue that's just affecting this particular character. It's to universalize it a bit more. And yeah, that's kind of where the multiple voices came from. Mechanically, one of the things that I did really early on was give them different catchphrases and different bits of symbolism that they were going to touch back on. So James has a persistent fear of saying something he doesn't mean to say. And often in his narration, it talks about like pressing his mouth shut and biting his lips. And that's, yeah, a particular piece of symbolism that I gave him. Noah has intrusive memories that occur as little snapshots, looking back to a particular trauma in his life. And Kenna has lots of different things, but yeah, there's particular symbols and particular lines that are echoed throughout her story that's helped to make her narration different and separate from the others. So that was something I tried really early on to build in so that the voices felt different.
Yeah. I think you definitely achieved that. And I mean, the other thing that I liked about the book was just sort of that all of these characters are very morally ambiguous, that they all are dealing with their trauma. They're all making some, I guess, morally questionable decisions at times, and you sort of get into their head and see why they're doing that. But yeah, on paper, they're perhaps not necessarily the kindest decisions, or yeah. So tell me about that, writing morally ambiguous characters.
Well, part of that I think came through my work in working with people with trauma, because they're not always the easiest people, but knowing some of their backstory really changes your perspective on their actions. So yeah, I mean, there's people that I've worked with that have committed crimes and offences, and that's in working with them connected back to their trauma, and it becomes really difficult to tell like how much of that is them and that they're flawed as a person, which we all are, and how much of it is a direct result of experiences that they've had. But what I found is that the more you know about someone, the harder it is to judge them. And that's something I really wanted to work into the book. And I didn't, in dealing with trauma, one of the things I really didn't want to do was make it simplistic. I didn't want a simple process of healing where everything's okay at the end. And I didn't want to show that it always was okay, because as we know, and as my research showed, because this book started off as a doctorate in creative writing, but trauma is often intergenerational. and is passed on, and not in necessarily the same way, but there are effects of it down the generations. So I wanted to include some of the complexity of that, and to include morally ambiguous characters who did the wrong thing. And there are moments in there for all of the characters that should make readers uncomfortable. That, I mean, they're supposed to. You're not supposed to really fully get behind any of the characters, but at moments they also all have moments where at least I as an author felt sympathetic towards them, and moments where they have victories, and I felt that was a richer way of representing some of the complexity of trauma. And characters are always an abstraction. They're never as complex as people. They're bits and pieces. They're like, you know, the join the dots version of a person. But yeah, I really wanted to make sure that some of those moments that they had were uncomfortable, that they then had regrets or didn't have regrets about that, but that's a starting point for conversation for readers to go, I really liked them, but I don't know that I agree with that thing that they did. And to look at what is morality, and how do we morally judge people who've been through experiences like these characters do.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, that makes sense. Because I think for me, James was the most difficult character to sort of read. He in particular, I had lots of moments of feeling uncomfortable with some of the decisions that he made along the way. Yeah, but I could certainly see that was the point, that you're,
and
it is
he
meant
was
to start
the one,
conversations.
Yeah, and he was the one I was most intentional about having other people read, because in many ways he was the last one that I decided to have as a first person narration, as a point of view in this narrative. I was going to have Ava, but one, I felt Ava's voice in the end became too similar, would have become too similar to Kenna's.
Yes.
And would have drawn too many mother-daughter comparisons. But yeah, James is in many ways the villain of the story. But he still has moments of sympathy, and moments where, you know, he experiences bad stuff. His life isn't simple or good, but he also pretty unilaterally does bad stuff, and has, you know, really profound negative effects on other people's lives. So those chapters I gave to other people to read, and it was just, am I pushing it too far? Is like, it's pretty sketchy. He's not a good dude. But yeah, I've appreciated in good YA fiction when the villains, the antagonists of the story are complex, and you do get to see things from their perspective a bit. I think it makes for a richer narrative.
I definitely agree. I think if you hadn't have included his point of view, he would have been a much more, just the caricature of a villain. And this way we do get to see behind the mask of what drove him to act the way he did.
Yeah,